So I think there's a number of things here to kind of weigh against each other. Very briefly, I think one thing I'd say is that Iran is still more sanctioned than Russia, which is something that I think has been missed a little bit in the way that American and European policymakers have talked about the sanctions program on Russia. The distinction is that although both countries are under central bank sanctions and broad sectoral sanctions, the difference is that the sanctions applied on Iran are secondary sanctions. So there is a greater enforcement capability where third countries trading with Iran can be punished for engaging with certain parts of the Iranian economy. And for example, the total prohibition of Iranian oil exports is very different in practice than the oil price cap we have for Russia.
Welcome to Velina's talk. Today's topic is dedicated to Iran, and my guest is Esfandyar Batmanghelidj, who is actually the founder and the CEO of the Bourse and Bazaar Foundation, a think tank focused on economic development and economic diplomacy in the Middle East and Central Asia. This podcast episode is recorded and facilitated with the support of Bharatvaarta Foundation. This is one of the most prominent Indian podcast producers on policy, politics, and society. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Velina. It's great to be here.
As you can imagine, we would unpack a lot of topics related to Iran's domestic and regional developments, and I would like to ask you to guide us a little bit through the current domestic developments. What has been going on regarding the political protests, maybe a kind of a short wrap up on your side, and of course, what is the prospect out of these political protests?
So we're at a really, I think, important moment in Iran's recent political history. The protests that began in September of last year following the killing of Mahsa Amini, a young woman, were actually unprecedented in a number of ways. I think what has really stuck out about these protests is that they reflect a deep-seated anger and level of frustration among large parts of Iranian society about basically a broken social contract. So there's a sense that the Iranian state is no longer meeting the needs of Iranian society. On one level, this is because of the economic turmoil that the country has been under for about a decade. But perhaps at a more important level for these protests, it is about a lack of consideration on the part of the state for the rights and privileges of Iran's society, and a view that previously Iranians could expect that through mechanisms such as parliamentary and presidential elections, they could have a say in the politics of the state. But following an election last year that saw President Ebrahim Raisi come to office with a historic low turnout, it was evident that elections are no longer really a mechanism for people to make their voice heard within Iran's political system. And so, what was left in the aftermath of this really awful incident where this young lady was killed was that the grief and anger of large parts of the Iranian population really came out in the form of protests. And those protests have continued at a sporadic level for around 4 months now. And the Iranian political system has really not had a major organized response to the demands of the protesters. There's been no clear effort to try and find a political solution for the anger that people are feeling, and there's been nothing in the way of conciliatory gestures from the government. And so we're at this kind of strange political impasse where it's not really clear where things are headed, but what is clear is that a lot of the things that have been true about the relationship between state and society in Iran for the last decade are no longer the case now, and that means that we have to think about fundamental political change in Iran.
Iran has a large share of a young population, well educated, of course, with the pandemic and with the deteriorating situation globally and regionally. This has certainly had an impact on the domestic dynamics, so to say. Would you also consider the, let's say, political landscape, the political climate with practically kind of a perpetual struggle between hardliners and reformists, which also kind of increased this pressure? And what may be the most realistic scenarios in the short term, in your view?
So that's an excellent question. The main thing there is that there was, until quite recently, a kind of competitive politics in Iran. And this is something that's often overlooked because of the view of Iran's political system as a theocracy that's dominated by a religious leader in the form of the supreme leader. But in reality, Iran's political system is more complicated and has a range of elected and unelected institutions that function with a kind of strange system of checks and balances. But within that system, you did have an elected president and an elected parliament that were important bodies with regards to how the government on a day-to-day basis was meeting the needs of the Iranian public. The presidential administration obviously oversees the various ministries that are responsible for Iran's welfare state, its economic policy making, the Ministry of Education and Health, for example. And so who is president matters in terms of defining kind of whether or not individuals in Iran are receiving services from the government at a very routine level. And then, of course, you have the parliament, which is responsible for lawmaking. And again, the composition of parliament did have some bearing in terms of what kinds of legal bills were coming forward and what kinds of priorities would be there for legislation that could make people's lives better or protect their rights, so forth. So where we have ended up is that those two institutions were subject to competitive politics between people of different political persuasions and political camps with different agendas. That is not to say that you had an enormous kind of breadth of political ideologies represented in Iran's political system. But as you mentioned, there was a basic way of dividing things where you sort of had hardliners on one side, more socially conservative, more interested in basically the ideology that brought the Islamic Revolution to fruition. And then you had a group of figures that are called reformists, typically, and they were individuals who believed in basically a process of reform whereby, generally speaking, the Iranian political system would become more liberal and more sort of, whether in a social sense or in an economic sense, so socially liberal, economically liberal. And that push and pull continued for a long time, and we've generally had let's say a reformist president, Khatami, in the early 2000s, followed by a more of a hardline president, Ahmadinejad followed him, and then returning to a reformist president in 2013 with the election of Hassan Rouhani. But what has happened in the last few years is that that push and pull, that competitive politics, was really eroded from the inside. And many of the unelected bodies within the Islamic Republic's political system intervened basically to weaken the political prospects of the reformist camp. And this really started during the course of President Hassan Rouhani's administration, where Rouhani appeared to be cementing a lot of the long-standing efforts of the reformists, including moves that would normalize relations with the West, reduce Iran's isolation in the international community for the benefit of, let's say, an economic development agenda that would improve the livelihoods of ordinary people. And perhaps because of a perception that the reformist camp was beginning to dominate the political fortunes of the country, there were these interventions. For example, in the course of in the presidential election in 2021, the vetting bodies that determined which candidates were able to run for office disqualified essentially all of the reformist candidates that had expressed an interest in running for president. And that really meant that there was only one candidate with a significant political bloc supporting them, and that was Ebrahim Raisi, who prior to becoming a presidential candidate was the head of the judiciary and came from a more of a hardline political background. And so when Raisi was elected, it was in an election where the Iranian public, recognizing that this competition was no longer taking place between reformists and hardliners, decided that they wouldn't even bother to turn out for the vote. And so while typically in Iran's post-revolution history, the turnout in presidential elections was around 70 to 80%. In this presidential election, the turnout was around 40%. And that is a statistic that was published by the Iranian Ministry of Interior after the election. And so basically, we end up in a situation where people no longer feel that going to the ballot box allows them to have their voice heard in an environment where politics is competitive. And so, fast forwarding to today, you have a situation where essentially, although there are still disagreements among political elites in Iran about the direction of the country, key foreign policy initiatives, issues around domestic policy, and the current protests, at the end of the day, broadly speaking, there is no longer that same diversity of opinion that has characterized Iran's politics up until recently. And so that's part of the reason why we have political paralysis, because you don't have the same number or authority in the voices that are saying we need to do things differently because the Iranian people are telling us they're not happy with the way the system is operating right now.
Next to the political stalemate that you perfectly described, or let's say political vacuum, there has been also a vacuum considering the progress of the negotiations on the so-called GCPOA 2.0, which was initiated by Biden's administration, given the fact that under the previous administration, under Trump's administration, the United States withdrew from the negotiated Iran deal, and under the current circumstances, Iran is alleged to continue its nuclear program. So, on the one hand, we should discuss a little bit the issue of a potential nuclear program, and of course, I do not mean the one based on the use of let's say nuclear power for civilian let's say for civilian use, but actually I of course mean the prospect of getting a nuclear weapon. And then of course what I also would like us to discuss is the topic of the prospect of negotiations at the international arena. Do you see any readiness on behalf of the United States or the European partners? We know very well that China and Russia have been quite vocal regarding the GCPOA 2.0 as well, and they have been closely coordinating between each other, but also with Iran on that matter. So I would like you to unpack these two issues a little bit. First, to give us a, let's say, background and an update regarding the nuclear program, and then to also explain a little bit the international environment of this matter.
So we've talked a little bit about how the political consolidation in Iran around the hardliners may be contributing to this moment of paralysis, this kind of stalemate right now during the protests. But there was already an indication of this paralysis before the protests even began in September. And we saw that indication in the area of foreign policy, specifically around the nuclear negotiations that were underway for the better part of 18 months until late this summer when really they hit a wall. And basically, the situation is that when President Biden came into office, he came into office with a promise to restore the nuclear deal. And he had articulated that promise during the campaign. And it was an important promise to make because it was one of the clear ways that the Biden administration was going to show the international community, especially European allies, that they were going to undo some of the damage that Trump had caused while he was in office. Unfortunately, although Biden had the option of basically coming into office on day one and restoring the nuclear deal unilaterally from the US side, the administration opted to take a different approach, whereby, in order to calm the nerves of regional allies, namely Israel and the GCC, they entered into a consultation period. So, senior administration officials, when the transition was complete, began to have meetings with GCC counterparts, Israeli counterparts, to explain what their Iran policy was going to look like. The problem was that they had a short window in which Biden was going to overlap with Hassan Rouhani, the Iranian moderate president who had really made it his mission from his first term to get nuclear diplomacy with the West on the agenda in Iran and to succeed in getting a nuclear deal, which he eventually did when the deal was adopted in 2015. Rouhani was up for re-election basically in the summer of 2021. So you had this kind of 6-month period where Biden could potentially restore a deal with Rouhani in office. The negotiations eventually did start in the late part of the spring of that year, and the Rouhani administration made a lot of progress very quickly in getting the deal back, getting basically the terms of the agreement that would see the deal restored. So what steps would each side need to take so that the JCPOA would be restored mutually with Iran and the US back into full compliance with their commitments. Somewhere along the way, possibly because the negotiations dragged on too close to the Iranian presidential election, the Rouhani administration was not able to take the draft of that agreement back to Tehran. The negotiators were unable to take the draft back to Tehran and basically get the deal signed off by the security establishment and particularly by the supreme leader. And so what ended up happening was that Raisi was elected in the summer, and there was a lot of concern in European capitals and in Washington that Raisi, who had been vocally critical of the JCPOA, whose cabinet was comprised of individuals who were very critical of the JCPOA, would basically announce that Iran wasn't going to continue the negotiations. After a few months where Raisi interestingly did something similar to Biden, they took time and they had their internal consultations about what is our Iran policy, what is our nuclear sort of negotiation stance going to be, how are we going to try and deal with the Iran policy of the West. They ended up resuming negotiations. And this gave people some optimism because one theory was that the fact that the hardliners controlled Iran's political system pretty much entirely at that point, after 2020 parliamentary elections and after Raisi's presidential triumph, there was a theory that that coherence would allow the security establishment in Iran to make that decisive move and restore the nuclear deal, because this time all the benefits of restoring the nuclear deal would come to them. It wouldn't be something that a reformist candidate could claim as a victory for the Iranian people, potentially burnishing their electoral prospects in future elections. It would be something that the hardliners could say, look, we're the ones who finally got this done. Unfortunately, it seems like that wasn't a sufficient condition to get the deal signed. We got very close to having an agreement in late February where the negotiators of Iran and the US and Europe were in Vienna with China and Russia as well, but they were playing a less important role at that stage. And the draft of the agreement to restore the JCPOA was ready. the European negotiators had actually returned to their capitals for final consultations. And if anyone was following this issue on Twitter, they would have seen these kind of valedictory photos of, negotiators walking through the streets of Vienna in a good mood because it seemed like they had finally done it. But not too many days before those pictures were taken, something else had happened in the world, namely, Russia had invaded Ukraine. And around the day after the European negotiators had returned to their capitals, when it seemed like everyone was about to make their final decision, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made a surprise demand. He demanded some kind of guarantee that while the West was sanctioning Russia, Russia would still be able to work with Iran when Iran receives sanctions relief under the JCPOA. And this threw a wrench in the gears, and basically the negotiations were stalled for many weeks. And when they eventually did resume, there was suddenly the sense that the deal was becoming difficult to grasp. And in the end, what really killed the agreement was Iranian indecisiveness. At the late summer, again, the text was finally there. The EU High Representative Joseph Borrell had sent a letter to the Iranians basically saying, this is the final text, we need a yes or no from you. And the response that the Iranians gave was highly unconstructive. And it became clear that something within the political system in Iran was not letting them make this final decision. And to go back to where I started in telling this whole story, it was an indication to many of us that there was a kind of paralysis in the political system in Iran, that the security establishment, if whether or not they had a consensus that they had formed that this was a good idea, that the supreme leader was unwilling to make that final decision and wasn't able to weigh in on that consensus with his own opinion. And so my view is that to the extent that we saw a kind of paralysis in decision making around the nuclear issue earlier this summer, we are now seeing the same kind of paralysis emerge when it comes to whether or not the Iranian political system can find some unified, sensible way to respond to the protests. And this is a very dangerous sign, because if both in the sphere of foreign policy and domestic policy, Iran is no longer a country where a complicated and in many ways sort of challenging political system can at the very least still make important decisions that are in the interests of its national security or in the interests of its sort of domestic political prospects, then Iran is actually a very different country than what it has been in the last 10 years, and it will be a more difficult country for the international community to deal with.
Before we move on other very important topics, I would like to ask an additional question regarding the GCPOA. Could it be, and of course this is a speculation as we don't have an access to all of this closed door information and the way how actually the political leaders were exchanging with each other during that period. As you said, and you perfectly outlined, it was a crucial window of opportunity. Then the war began, the war that Russia launched against Ukraine on the 24th of February. And as we know, Russia was and remains a stakeholder in this negotiation process. Could it be that there was a clear signal coming from Moscow to Iran that Russia would not agree on any further, let's say, negotiations and would never sign a GCPOA, being in this very unique situation? Let's just, point to the fact that Russia is now the most sanctioned country, so obviously overshadowing Iran since 2022 in that matter. And as you've rightfully mentioned, also the topic where Moscow tried to find a backdoor via the negotiations and, let's say, via a possible GCPOA to bypass sanctions, actually thanks to Iran. Do you think that this was also one of the reasons for the Iranian establishment to say, okay, at this point, there is little sense to continue. And probably, given the strong support coming from the West to Ukraine, it would be also, seen from the Iranian perspective, it will be very hard to, let's say, justify GCPOA 2.0 signed by the West, by the very same West that, in fact, would create a kind of domestic reaction. Would that be also the case, given the, let's say, strategic partnership between Iran and Russia?
So I think there's a number of things here to kind of weigh against each other. Very briefly, I think one thing I'd say is that Iran is still more sanctioned than Russia, which is something that I think has been missed a little bit in the way that American and European policymakers have talked about the sanctions program on Russia. The distinction is that although both countries are under central bank sanctions and broad sectoral sanctions, the difference is that the sanctions applied on Iran are secondary sanctions. So there is a greater enforcement capability where where countries, third countries trading with Iran can be punished for engaging with certain parts of the Iranian economy. And for example, the total prohibition of Iranian oil exports is very different in practice than the oil price cap we have for Russia. But that's actually important for this assessment because I think on one hand, the Russians still have a belief in the importance of the global non-proliferation regime. That's not necessarily out of the goodness of their hearts. I think it's because they want to maintain the geostrategic advantage they have from being a nuclear power in a world with very few nuclear powers. And what they certainly don't want to see is that Iran, a country that they treat to whatever degree they treat as a partner, Iran is treated as a junior partner. They don't want Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon that provides it a level of security that would mean that the strategic partnership with Russia is something that is defined on a more on a basis of the two countries being equals. At the moment, and we see this to an extent with the narrative and the expectations around the drone transfer, where Iran has supplied drones for Russia's use in Ukraine, which itself became a very complicating factor in, at least at a political level, the European and American commitment to the nuclear deal towards the end of the summer. It's interesting that in return, there is this expectation that possibly Russia would provide Iran more significant military equipment, including fighter jets and possibly air defense systems and tanks. Things that Iran does not really produce domestically. It produces drones and ballistic missiles to compensate for the fact that its conventional military capabilities are relatively limited. So you have all of these elements, and I think basically here there is, at a strategic level, still an interest on the part of Russia to support non-proliferation diplomacy. When Raisi was in Moscow at the beginning of 2022, Putin pressed him publicly to clarify his administration's position on the JCPOA, to indicate that they were going to go back into the deal. And you have had language from senior Russian officials, including the ambassador to the IAEA in Vienna, Ulyanov, talking about Russia's commitment to the JCPOA. And I don't think it's just words. I think they do see value in the agreement. And it is largely because what they don't want Iran to do is to decide that they are already paying the costs for being a threshold nuclear state, or a state that has actually built a nuclear weapon, and so that they would make that step, withdraw from the NPT, and make that fraught but significant step to actually have a nuclear weapons program, which at the moment is still not the assessment of US and European intelligence. The view is that Iran has not yet made that decision. I think it's in Russia's interest for Iran not to go that far. And it is largely about this idea that yes, maybe the Russia-Iran partnership is something that is more important now that Russia is under sanctions and in this confrontation with the West. But if they're going to maximize that partnership, they want to be able to take advantage of Iran, and therefore they need to treat Iran as a junior partner. And that's a dynamic that has existed in Russia-Iran relations for the better part of a couple centuries, actually.
So, how do you anticipate the growing role of Iran in the region and beyond, given the global power shifts now with the US and China obviously being involved in a kind of a systemic, let's say, conflict? Encompassing all relevant areas. Iran is, let's say, geostrategically located and has become already part of several interesting transport corridors, energy corridors from, let's say, the Asian to giants China, but also India, towards Europe and the other way around. So, do you see that there is a kind of dichotomy? On the one hand, given these, let's say, highly negative domestic developments, the political vacuum, the stalemate, if you like, in terms of the negotiation process, and then on the other hand, we have, this kind of, let's say, geopolitical demand coming from the key players to engage more actively with Iran. We see how Russia is critically reliant on the military equipment coming from Iran. In fact, many experts were anticipating that there will be more aid coming from China, probably to some extent from India, from Turkey, but Turkey is obviously supporting Ukraine on that matter. Think of the drones. And here, Iran has started playing a critical role for the Russian establishment to continue this war of attrition. Then again, think of the agreements with China. Given the possibility of exploration of fossil fuels, but also given the possibility of infrastructure build up, transport corridors, all of these really, really interesting things an economist would like to cover. And then again, what we've been hearing is also now the growing interest coming from India, given the fact that India and Russia finally sealed this international north-south transport corridor that entails Iran. The negotiations have been ongoing for the last 20 years. And we also know that the energy-deprived Europe is certainly going to be interested in more fossil fuels coming from Iran, be it oil or gas. So all of this put together creates a kind of an interesting geo-economic dynamic. Can Iran capitalize on that? And if yes, in what kind of way?
Uh, the short answer is no, they can't capitalize on it. And, I think there is a view that in some ways, this moment where West and East are moving into a more definitive moment of confrontation is finally Iran's chance to capitalize on its geostrategic position, to really start to build a partnership with Russia and China. And, my assessment of this, having followed the development of Iran's relations with Russia and China in particular, Iran's efforts to become integrated in these kind of regional economic projects over the last decade, is that there really is very, very limited scope for these partnerships to emerge and become really robust and functional. And there's a number of reasons for this. But the first thing I would sort of push back on is the idea that the support Iran is providing to Russia has made Iran critical to Russia. What we have seen is that the drones were, I think, an important sort of symbolic move in terms of Russia indicating that it was able to tap into its relationships with certain countries to find new capacities to maintain the war effort. But the drones themselves are quite unsophisticated. Ukrainian air defense has proven mostly successful at dealing with them. the way that the drones, my understanding, although I'm not a defense expert, the way that the drones are being used is that they're used to overload air defense systems. And so there's a large sort of obligation operationally to have lots of these drones ready to go, because if you know, deploy 20 of them and 18 get shot down, this is basically the way that you're inflicting harm in the arena where they're being used. And the reality is that there appears to have been a slowdown in deliveries of these drones to Russia in recent months. And it's not clear why that is. Is it because Iran is holding back because they've seen some of the response to the drone sales to Russia? Is it because Iran feels that it hasn't gotten what it was promised from Russia in return? In any case, the ability of Russia to wage this war does not really depend on Iran's support. And when it comes to Iran and its position, economically speaking, the fact that Russia has found itself in this war and the fact that Russia is now a major sanctioned economy is actually very bad news, because as I've been recently working on for a forthcoming chapter in a book that will look at Russia-Iran relations, the fundamental position of the Russian and Iranian economies at the level of how the composition of their economies and how they've sort of work in the context of who they trade with and what they export pushes these two economies to compete. The two countries basically need the same stuff from their suppliers, namely China, and they are mostly exporting the same goods: hydrocarbons, mining, different kinds of mining products, and steel and iron goods. And so what they're now forced to do, given that they're sanctioned, is try and sell goods to the same countries in order to buy the same goods from those countries. And this is sort of pitting companies in Iran and Russia into competition. And the clearest way that we're seeing this is that Russian crude oil exports to China are competing with Iranian crude oil exports to China, and the Russians, because of their more cost-effective production and their perhaps better logistics routes and the fact that they produce much more oil than Iran does, they're able to basically discount their oil more aggressively. And so they are, in theory, in a position to take a larger portion of market share in the Chinese market away from Iran. Now, we might think that at a political level, the governments in these countries would realize, okay, we are in a moment of confrontation with the West. We better start working together as a bloc to try and make sure that, we are maximizing our potential economically and also from a national security standpoint. And so we do see some initiatives to that extent. You saw last year Iran join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the China-led bloc, a body that Iran had been basically trying to join for a decade. Interestingly, the reason that they hadn't been able to join in that last decade is because there was a statutory provision in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's governing articles that said that a country under UN sanctions could not join their body. And Iran, for the better part of the last decade, was under a UN sanctions program until the nuclear deal was concluded. Now, of course, Iran faces the prospect of potentially being under a UN sanctions program again because of its unresolved nuclear program and other issues. And so there is this idea that bodies like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they are maybe useful as a platform to convene leaders from these countries to do some agenda setting. But when it comes to actually implementing the agenda of economic cooperation that is necessary to really build resiliency to American and European economic coercion, for example, coordinating investments in significant infrastructure along the key transport corridors, let's say on the north-south axis across the Caspian, where a lot of investment would need to be made to make those corridors viable, or along the east-west axis to allow China to trade goods with Russia and Iran more easily over land. It's very unlikely, in my view, that the bodies like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the Eurasian Economic Union are really designed or able to implement those kinds of investments. And so what we're left with is this idea that, yes, at some level, maybe geopolitically, the value of cooperation between these countries is clearer than ever before. But the same practical barriers that have prevented significant cooperation for the last decade, namely the limitations that sanctions create for banking and logistics cooperation. It's notable that there is not a single major Chinese foreign direct investment in Iran. This is something that is almost never talked about. We often think that China is this enormous economic partner in Iran. It is the most important trade partner, but there are no major Chinese investments of the kind that China has made in other countries, especially other countries in the Middle East. And likewise, and this is less surprising, but there's no major Russian foreign direct investment that's been made in Iran. And I think at an institutional or cultural level, imagining that, overnight, even in light of this geopolitical necessity, there would be the levels of trust and the level of mutual understanding and the level of legal frameworks that would allow these kinds of investments to begin is difficult to imagine. But even if they do begin, it's going to be many years before they materialize into the kinds of increased capacities that would allow Russia and Iran to take trade that is, in $2-3 billion a year and grow it to something where it actually somehow compensates for the enormous negative economic impact that Russia is experiencing because of basically losing Europe as its primary market. So to summarize, I agree that at some level there is this geopolitical and strategic impetus for these countries to work together. And we are going to see more rhetoric about cooperation, no doubt about it. But at a fundamental level, I think actually what the West has done successfully, whether it was deliberate or not, is it is constraining these countries, closing the walls in on them in a way that actually increases the likelihood that they will compete um, in ways that lead to the loss of these transformative economic opportunities. Because countries that are locked in intense competition in this environment, specifically Russia and Iran, are not going to be countries that I think are likely to solve these long-standing barriers to deeper strategic partnership. For example, mobilizing billions of investment that's necessary to open the barriers to trade.
Thank you very much for highlighting these critical issues between potential partners. As I've been saying this since the time when Russia became militarily engaged in Syria, and as we know, Iran was already militarily involved with boots on the ground. That very often experts were considering their coordination on the ground as a kind of a strategic partnership, whereas both Iran and Russia have been pursuing let's say, competing interests, specifically geopolitical and geo-economic interests. And from Russia's point of view, blocking Iranian fossil fuels to not enter the European market has been always a kind of a geostrategic goal. You've outlined the one side of the coin regarding potential partners. But there is the other side of the coin where we've had this very troubled relationship with the United States, and also now increasingly deteriorating relationship with the European Union. Could you give us a kind of overview where you think these relations with the West are headed to in the short term?
Well, I think the relations are headed in a very negative direction, and this is because of Iran's apparent willingness to really sacrifice whatever goodwill it had developed in those periods in which, for example, after the conclusion of the nuclear deal, there was some hope that negotiations and diplomacy could lead to understandings between the West and Iran, and through that mutual understanding, you could have better let's say, foreign policy outcomes at a minimum. Obviously, the human rights situation in Iran is very concerning. The execution of protesters, the brutal suppression of the protests, I think has confirmed for many that the consolidation of the government in the hands of hardliners was a very negative development for the domestic civil society and for the ability of people to engage in political action. And aside from that, I think it's worth noting that, perhaps even more so than the protests, at least when you speak in private settings with European officials, the thing that really vexes them about where Iran is headed is the idea that they have provided material support to Russia in the form of drones for the war in Ukraine, which is, of course, something that predated the protests, but I think it was the thing that really triggered this view that maybe the Europe-Iran relationship was not going to be repaired with the nuclear deal being restored. And it's difficult to understate how significant this is. I mean, for a long time, within kind of Western policy towards Iran, there was a broad transatlantic consensus about that Iran needed to be dealt with in a serious way because of the risks that it was posing within the region, and certainly the risks related to its nuclear program. But there was a division of labor, kind of good cop, bad cop. The US was always, by nature, a little bit more hawkish towards Iran. And within the European sort of system, the European Union was more of a mediator, and certain member states had more of a kind of mediation role with Iran. I'd say Italy, the Nordic countries, were generally countries, and Germany, that were interested in using diplomacy. France and the UK tended to view Iran a little bit more along the lines of the US, with a more of a hawkish view. But where we are now is that basically there's a fairly uniform view in Europe that Iran is, posing a significant security threat, that it is engaged in gross human rights violations. And so that diversity of opinion, or that sort of capacity within Europe to have both a very tough line on Iran, but also find spaces where there was trust and openness for dialogue. At this point, it's very difficult to imagine that you could continue the nuclear negotiations in the current political environment, because the space for dialogue has just shrunk dramatically. And this is both a reflection, I think, of the views of policymakers themselves, but also it's worth noting that many in the diaspora community in Europe and in Iran have articulated the view that negotiations are inappropriate at this moment, and actually it would even be in the European interest to withdraw their ambassadors from Iran altogether. And that's a really dramatic shift from where we have been at any point in the, let's say, 20 long years of Europe trying to engage Iran through a course of negotiations, starting with the nuclear file. And as I said to you before we started the program, one of the real challenges here is that it used to be that European and American diplomats trying to deal with Iran would be able to compartmentalize issues. So the nuclear file was kept separate from other files, and the nuclear deal was precisely that. It was just a nuclear deal. And the idea was, let's address the nuclear program, and then we can move on to concerns around Iran's ballistic missile program, its actions in the region, or its domestic kind of human rights violations. Today, it's very difficult to imagine how you compartmentalize, because in a way, all of these issues have been interlinked. They've been interlinked because of how things have played out, the drone sales during the course of the negotiations, happening in close succession with the start of the protests, and the fact that the demands are now being interlinked. So policymakers concerned about Iran's human rights behavior are also concerned about the effect of Iran's activities with regards to Ukraine. Members of the Iranian public in Iran who are angry at their government over domestic issues are also angry at their government because of things related to foreign policy. it's all becoming interlinked in a way that it, of course, was before, but there was an ability to compartmentalize because there was a sort of political understanding that that was the appropriate strategy. And so, to the extent that that is now more difficult, I'm not going to say it's impossible, and I think it may still be necessary, but to the extent that it is more difficult, it is hard to see how the space for negotiations is maintained. I think more likely what we will see happen is that if the political space for direct negotiations by European governments and the US is closed for a time, particularly while the situation domestically in Iran remains so dire, we will probably see more reliance on sort of mediation by third countries, possibly the GCC countries, Turkey, maybe even a country like India stepping in to try and maintain some degree of calm in the situation. Because at this point, given the trajectory that we've been on, Iran is enriching uranium to the highest levels it has ever enriched uranium. The breakout time, which is the time for Iran to actually produce the uranium necessary for a single nuclear weapon, is the shortest it's ever been. And there is some argument that Iran is already what you could consider a threshold nuclear state. They've never built a weapon device and they've never tested a device, but there's some suspicion that they have the capability, they just haven't made that decision yet. And if you look at it in a regional context, that is a very worrying prospect for countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, but also further afield countries like India and Turkey. And so it's possible that those countries intervene really out of their own self-interest to try and prevent Iran from taking that final step. But it's not clear that those interventions will work because, of course, the leverage that is placed on Iran to try and prevent it from going that far, which is namely the leverage around the US sanctions program and the idea that if there's an agreement, those sanctions get lifted. What's not clear is what carrots can other countries offer Iran to prevent them from going down that path? And why would Iran necessarily withhold itself from going down that path if it's already paying for so many of the costs? So I will conclude this sort of answer with a kind of counterintuitive optimistic statement, which is that maybe the saving grace here is that if Iran's political system is really in a moment of paralysis, perhaps that paralysis will also prevent them from taking that very significant, fateful decision to actually, for example, withdraw from the NBT and dash for a bomb. So in some ways, that is maybe the one thing that is giving us some cause for optimism, is that if Iran can't make a decision to conclude the nuclear deal with all of the benefits that were there on the table, maybe they're not going to be in a position to actually go for a nuclear weapon, given all of the potential costs that are there on the table. And instead, we're going to be stuck in this moment of sort of turmoil and a lack of clarity about what the actual position is of the Iranian state with regards to these issues for the foreseeable future.
A last question on my side is, of course, very much linked to the future of the region. Now, you've already pointed to some of the criticalities in the bilateral and multilateral formats of relations. Would you consider a scenario in which there would be a kind of normalization of the relations between Iran on the one hand and, let's say, Saudi Arabia on the other hand, and also why not even with in the trilateral format with Israel? Let's consider that there have been some very positive developments in the last several years, such as the Abraham Accords, and given also the refocus of the United States towards, on the one hand, Europe, but in a much longer um, longer run, actually, towards the Indo-Pacific, there may be a kind of also geopolitical vacuum that would push these actors to come closer. And I would also like to hear your opinion on the possibility that the United States might consider lifting some of the sanctions, specifically from Iranian crude oil exports, given the pressure on the global markets or oil markets right now with the sanctioning of the Russian crude. So what's your take on that matter as well? So is there any scenario that actually would be described as a positive one? We know that Iran is still very much militarily involved in both Syria and Yemen, and we know also about how chronically long-lasting this kind of problematic relationships have looked like over decades in this specific region. But is there any hope, let's say, in this particular decade, and given the political stalemate at home, that there might be a window of opportunity where Iran would consider also, let's say, a kind of normalization of relations with the direct rivals in the region?
So I think I've painted a very dark picture over the course of our conversation. The regional sort of dynamics are an area where things have been definitely more positive. And there, as you've mentioned, there were a lot of really good developments in the last couple of years. I'll also point to the Baghdad summit that happened in a multilateral format um, in, I guess, 2021 in Baghdad and last year in Amman. Um, what was, I think, really positive there is the idea that the GCC countries in particular realized that they needed to take a different approach towards Iran. Saudi Arabia is a little bit of a laggard in that, but the UAE has reopened diplomatic relations. Their ambassador is back in Tehran, and there is a dialogue there. Saudi Arabia, there have been, I believe, 5 or 6 rounds of bilateral negotiations. They are sort of stalled at this point, but in any case, the tensions were reduced through those talks. Part of the reason that I think those talks were moving forward was because, on one hand, all of the regional actors saw kind of how much they stood to lose if there was a significant escalation in the Persian Gulf. And 2019 was really the critical year where, in response to the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, Iran um, instigated attacks on a set of tankers off the coast of Fujairah in the UAE, and also struck at Saudi oil facilities using drones. And essentially, those attacks kind of showed everyone, well, if the tensions continue to rise and these are the kinds of actions that are going to be taken, it's going to be to all of our detriment. And so, in some ways, that was the trigger for a lot of the diplomacy to take place. I also think there was an expectation that Iran would get the nuclear deal restored, and a kind of more open and economically empowered Iran would necessarily shift the balance of power in the region a little bit. And I think the GCC countries recognize that rather than try and prevent that eventuality, it would make more sense to benefit from it. And in fact, in the joint US GCC communiques that were issued during the course of the nuclear negotiations, there was very interesting language about GCC countries participating in Iran's economic opening when the JCPOA was restored. And that's very different from what we had in the lead up to the negotiations of the original JCPOA talks in 2013, 2014, 2015. So this has been a bright spot. The open question is what happens now? You have an Iran that is being isolated again by the West. Do the countries in the region decide that, well, Iran's going to be weaker, let's take advantage of this opportunity and turn back to our confrontational position? Or do they come to the conclusion that Iran is going to be weaker and so it might lash out? Let's protect ourselves proactively by having a dialogue with the Iranians, by trying to find ways of keeping the temperature in the region low. And it's very difficult to say how that would play out. Another dynamic here is that Netanyahu is back in power in Israel. And although I think the Biden administration was relatively successful at keeping Lapid and Bennett sort of quiet during the nuclear negotiations, Netanyahu's approach with Iran was very different. It was about kinetic action within Iran that was necessarily of the kind that would provoke an Iranian response. It remains to be seen whether he decides to do that sort of thing again, sabotaging facilities in Iran, assassinating Iranian generals or nuclear scientists. And if that's the way that things go, the Abraham Accords are interesting because conceivably, if those accords are real and actually provide a basis for dialogue, if the GCC countries believe that it is not in the region's interest to have another round of escalation, we would want to see those countries in their dialogue with Israel basically tell the Netanyahu government, hey, we don't want you to do anything dramatic in Iran, because if you do something dramatic, there's a good chance that they, instead of Iran striking Israel, which it may not have the capability to do, they might strike somewhere else in the region to prove a point at the expense of basically this regional dialogue that's taking place. So, there are other people better placed than me to break down the regional dialogue. I'm mostly seeing this from the Iranian perspective. The Israeli perspective, GCC perspectives are different, and even within the GCC, there's a different set of views. But I think the question is, can the regional diplomacy that has been so positive in the last couple of years, can it basically survive this very tumultuous moment that we're in? And it is difficult for me to say. I think part of the reason why is also that, again, if, for example, normalization with Saudi Arabia is a major decision that needs to be taken by the Iranian security establishment, is that a decision that can be taken in a situation where, again, we might think that there's paralysis within the decision-making bodies in Iran's government? So, a lot of opportunities are still there to be seized. And although things have been very optimistic, I'm concerned that a lot of that momentum might be lost because Iran is not in the same position it was even 6, 7 months ago to really take advantage of these opportunities through that diplomacy.
Well, this podcast episode is coming to an end, and we now have even more questions than at the beginning of the session, which means also that I will certainly invite you to be my guest again. And thanks to Bharatvaarta, which has been facilitating this, and all of the other podcast episodes of Velina's talk, I have learned a lot throughout the last 60 minutes. Esfandyar, it was great to be our guest today, and thank you very much for your insights and your views on the matters considering Iran.
Thank you, Velina. I really enjoyed it, and hope we have another opportunity soon to see how these things develop.
Let's hope for a more positive scenario out of the many dark and pessimistic scenarios that you've outlined. I would rather say realistic ones, as geopolitical analysts are often described as those with kind of cynicism in their views and opinions. But we tend to say, okay, hope for the best, prepare for the worst.